Hi there, I'm John,
And I'm Ash.
and let's talk magic. Alright, so today we're going to talk about the different kinds of sanctioned formats that you can play in Magic the Gathering.
Well, there's the first, we have the types of decks.
Oh yeah.
We're doing the types of decks first.
Okay. So there are four main types of decks in Magic. The first of which is aggro, or an aggressive deck. So an aggressive deck would use small creatures, mainly to just attack your opponent before they can do anything big. So good examples of this would be mono red in standard right now.
Mm-hmm.
Your black-white warrior decks are usually aggressive. Even some versions of Abzan are aggressive.
They're usually widespread decks. Like they'll just make the board state just very wide and just tons of creatures that are just constantly attacking. So the opponent is just overwhelmed and just can't take care of, doesn't have the cards to take care of all of the creatures that they have attacking them. Then there's control, which is back again. We didn't have control for a while, and a lot of Magic players were really upset about not having control in standard. So now we have control back in standard. Now everybody's really upset that we have control. So
I'd say it's the most polarizing archetype. Either you love control decks and playing them, or you hate them. So we're a pretty good example of that.
Yeah.
I'm on the side of love. She's on the side of hate with that. And control decks are just mainly the antithesis of aggro decks.
Mm-hmm.
So you're the one that's just trying to answer everything before it kills you, and then play one finisher that your opponent can't answer. So it's a classic like tug of war, but when those two get paired.
Yeah, and with the cards that we have in standard right now for control, it's pretty viable. There's also combo decks, which before Fate Reforged and Dragons, Jeskai Ascendancy was really big. That's the deck where you would have a mana dork, and you'd have the Jeskai Ascendancy, and then you'd have Retraction Helix, and you would be able to.
You'd bounce like a small permanent like Springleaf Drum or something, you would tap your mana dork for mana. You'd play your Springleaf Drum.
Mm-hmm.
You would get to untap and loot. So you would draw a card and discard a card to go through your deck further. And then you could tap, return the Springleaf Drum, or usually a 0-cost artifact like Briber's Purse. And then you can play it again, untap, loot, and then eventually you would find a win condition. In that deck, it was Altar of the Brood, which was whenever a permanent came into play, your opponent mills one card.
So you just mill them out, pass the turn, and then they wouldn't have a card to draw from their deck because you just milled them. You just did that combo 60 times. So
they wouldn't have a deck to draw from.
And then they lose.
So the basics of a combo deck is basically you want to get beat up as much as you can without dying, and then kill them in one turn.
Yeah.
That's about, so like aggro decks are easier than the control decks because the control decks can answer your combo, but the aggro decks, you just wait until they're about to kill you and then you kill them.
Right.
It's one of my favorite things to do.
And then there's mid-range. Mid-range is the type of deck that, it's probably one of the decks that I'm most comfortable with. It has big creatures or big answers, but also takes its time to. It isn't much of an aggro deck, but it also isn't control or any type of beatdown deck. Until you start getting, you make sure that you have all of the answers to what they are playing. It's a slower deck, which makes it not that great against all of the like really fast mono red type aggro decks, but it's also definitely a better matchup against like control decks or combo decks if you get the correct answers in time.
Yeah, so mid-range would be just basically in the middle of the spectrum of aggro and control.
Mhm.
You're not a completely reactive deck, but you're not completely aggressive. You just
You kind of have a little bit of everything, which
you
is
play
wonderful.
you play with the tempo of the game. You answer their threat, and then you play a threat, and then when they answer your threat, you
Mhm.
play another one. Or if they play another threat, you answer their threat. It's kind of a very back and forth game if you play a mid-range deck.
Yeah, and usually with like those type of tempo decks, like a mid-range deck, you usually have the answers to as much as you possibly can, and it works out really well for you. I think more people should play mid-range decks.
And then an honorable mention to the devotion decks that have been around since Theros. They don't really fit on the spectrum. They're somewhere between mid-range and combo, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that they're a slower, like, they get going and then they keep going kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But then you also had your draws that were very explosive and resembled something like a combo deck would do.
Yeah.
Where you just make like 22 mana in one turn and kill.
They can be very overwhelming. They can be very overwhelming where you just can't handle it if you can't do a board wipe.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of decks that you can play in Magic together.
I'm Ash.
And I'm John.
And we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Magic.